Hello everyone. Thank you very much for coming to this presentation. I am presenting our research on video gaming law and regulation, in particular the regulation of so-called loot boxes in video games. In recent years, loot boxes have been the subject of public controversy and regulatory attention due to their apparent structural similarities with gambling. People who attended the conference last year might remember our research on loot box probability disclosure regulations in China that we presented. This research expands on that work. Before I start the presentation, I would like to thank Chinese CDiGRA and the friends that we met last year. This research relies on a survey, and without everyone's help with publicizing it through WeChat, online forums, and mailing lists, this research might not have been possible at all. So what exactly is a loot box? Loot boxes are virtual consumable items in video games that can be opened by players who obtain randomized rewards of varying in-game and real-world value. They can take on many different virtual forms, such as treasure chests, card packs, prize wheels, or gacha. Many games contain these mechanics, including, for example, Genshin Impact and Wangzhe Rongyao. Our research focuses on paid loot boxes that require money to buy. These are seemingly more harmful as they can directly cause overspending of real-world money by players. Some games allow for player trading, enabling loot box rewards to be transferred between players. These systems may enable players to sell in-game items for real-world money. This means that these loot box rewards gain real-world monetary value. What can loot box rewards do? Some rewards are just cosmetic. For example, they may take your sword and make it glow green instead of red, or give you gold rather than silver armor, without any increase in power. Other rewards actually influence gameplay. For example, they could unlock additional content, or give the player a competitive advantage over other players, such as more powerful weapons that can defeat enemies more easily. This means that players who paid for loot boxes can become stronger than other players, thus potentially encouraging these other players to also buy loot boxes so that they can compete on a more equal footing. This may create a stronger incentive to buy loot boxes, which give a competitive advantage than those which are merely cosmetic. How much do people spend on loot boxes? We don't have conclusive data on worldwide loot box spending because this data is held by game companies and they don't release their loot box sales data to the public. However, in China, the Ministry of Culture required video game companies to publicly disclose the results of all loot box openings. This meant that loot box purchasing history is available as public data for some games. We have been able to figure out that just one single game, Counter-Strike Global Offensive, generates a daily revenue of over $500,000 in China alone. So the worldwide spending on loot boxes is very substantial. Extreme cases of individual players' loot box spending have been reported in mainstream media, such as one UK player spending nearly £700 in 1 month. Another player spent over $10,000 in just 2 years on the loot boxes of one single game. The BBC also reported in 2019 on a case where 4 children spent nearly £550 of their father's money on loot boxes without permission and still didn't get the rare item they were after. What are the potential harms of loot boxes? The first potential harm of loot boxes is their structural similarities to gambling. They both involve the player or gambler paying an amount of money with the hope of obtaining more money or something more valuable through a randomized process. Secondly, empirical evidence has consistently established that there is a relationship between loot box spending and problem gambling. Specifically, that the more severe that participants' problem gambling was, the more money they spent on loot boxes. I do note, however, that we do not yet know if loot boxes cause people to become problem gamblers, or if people who are already problem gamblers are more likely to spend a lot of money on loot boxes. Loot boxes have become prevalent across all major video gaming platforms. You may remember from our presentation last year that we found that 91% of the 100 highest grossing iPhone games do contain loot boxes in China. Researchers are particularly concerned about children and other vulnerable groups being exposed to loot boxes. The UK Gambling Commission has found that 22.9% of the UK's 11 to 16-year-olds have paid for loot boxes. Regulators around the world are considering whether or not to regulate loot boxes because of their potential harms and because of how easily children can have access to them. This is why the regulation of loot boxes is a global consumer protection challenge. However, the existing literature has focused only on Western samples and the experience of players from Western countries. For example, the correlation between loot box purchasing and problem gambling severity mentioned earlier has been consistently replicated. However, those replications took place using only Western samples. We know from prior cross-cultural studies of multiple Western countries that the strength of this relationship is weaker in some countries than in others. This relationship could be weaker or stronger in non-Western countries, or the relationship might not even exist because of inherent differences. For example, we know that the national video game markets in various countries can be very different structurally. Our previous research on the prevalence of loot boxes in China found that 91% of the highest grossing iPhone games contain loot boxes, and that this was significantly higher than the 59% found in the UK. We also found that 90.5% of games deemed suitable for children aged 12 and above in China contained loot boxes, compared to the 58.9% in the UK, which was significantly lower. In addition to structural differences in the video game markets, how gambling is regulated is also different. In addition to structural differences in the video game markets, how gambling is regulated is also different. The only form of legal gambling in China is the lotteries, while in Western countries, the legalization of gambling has led to a proliferation of different types of legal gambling, from sports betting to slot machines, from casino games to easily accessible gambling apps on mobile phones. This means that Chinese video game players have significantly less access to legalized gambling than video game players in Western countries do. Additionally, China and the West also differ in terms of loot box regulation. In China, some degree of consumer protection is provided in relation to loot boxes by the Ministry of Culture's legal requirement for game companies to disclose the probabilities of obtaining randomized rewards. In contrast, loot boxes are generally unregulated in the West, although I note that two specific countries, Belgium and the Netherlands, have imposed loot box regulation. This means that players in China may be making more informed loot box purchasing decisions than players in Western countries, because they are aware of how likely or unlikely they are to obtain the rewards they want, and how much on average it would cost them to do so. Given so many differences between China and Western countries, it must be asked whether the same relationship between loot box purchasing and problem gambling would replicate in non-Western countries, such as China. Our study was a cross-sectional survey that participants self-selected into participating, so the usual disclaimers apply. We advertised via online video gaming forums, and we received 879 effective responses after excluding people who did not live in mainland China, people who were not aged 18 or above, and people who did not play video games within the last 12 months, as well as people who provided non-serious responses. Participants were predominantly young male students. This is not surprising given that similar previous studies in Western countries using similar methodologies also recruited nearly 90% male participants. We measured four main things. Firstly, how much money the participants spent on loot boxes in the past 12 months. Secondly, we asked about past year gambling participation. Thirdly, for those participants who did report participating in gambling, we measured their problem gambling severity using the Problem Gambling Severity Index, PGSI. And finally, we measured the impulsiveness of all participants. We pre-registered our hypotheses that we will find positive correlation between loot box spending and problem gambling severity, between loot box spending and past year gambling participation, and between loot box spending and impulsiveness. As to hypothesis 1, the positive correlation between loot box spending and problem gambling severity, when we tried to replicate this same correlation in China, we failed. Our failure to replicate could be due to a variety of reasons, including cultural differences, or that loot box spending may only be correlated with more gamified gambling activities. This could include slot machine mobile apps, which are illegal in China. This failure could also be due to methodological reasons. Previous studies gave the problem gambling severity assessment scale to all participants, including those who never gambled. This may have caused a degree of nuisance reporting that exaggerated the effect. More research needs to be done on this, because if this relationship does not exist in non-Western countries, then there is less justification for regulating loot boxes. As to hypothesis 2, the positive correlation between loot box spending and past year gambling participation, we found a very weak positive correlation in China that is likely not clinically significant. As to hypothesis 3, the positive correlation between loot box spending and impulsiveness, we again found a very weak positive correlation in China that is likely not clinically significant. Overall, there appears to be a weaker relationship between gambling and loot boxes in China than there is in Western countries. So why was it necessary to find out whether this relationship would replicate? This is because this relationship has been relied upon by policymakers and regulators to justify needing to regulate loot boxes. If this relationship does not exist in a country, then the argument for regulating the mechanism in that country does become weaker. We know that both developed and developing countries across the world are considering regulating loot boxes. It would be inappropriate for the Western literature to be assumed to be applicable to players in, for example, Brazil, without further research. It would also be wrong to impose restrictions on individual freedom on the basis of research that would not be replicable to the population that the restrictions are intended to apply to. Our research in China only represents a first step to better understanding this issue. As I mentioned before, China uniquely legally requires video game companies to disclose the probabilities of obtaining randomized rewards from loot boxes as a consumer protection measure. Here are two screenshots to demonstrate what loot box probability disclosure means. In the example on the left, we can see that if we bought this loot box, we would have a 5% chance of obtaining an item of 5-star rarity. In the example on the right, we can see probabilities disclosed for specific items. For example, a player has a 1% chance of obtaining Mario. Our previous research has found that probability disclosures are often implemented in manners that are difficult for players to access. For example, in this game, players had to follow multiple hyperlinks, be redirected to multiple pages, and then do some scrolling in order to access the disclosure. Not all players may end up completing all these steps. So we took the chance of this survey to also ask our participants whether they have seen probability disclosures in the games that they play. Of the 428 participants who self-reported having purchased loot boxes in the last 12 months, 84.6% reported having seen probability disclosures. This reflects that most loot box purchasers have in fact seen disclosures despite them being implemented through suboptimal methods. So does seeing the disclosure reduce spending? To answer this, we asked whether players bought fewer loot boxes and spent less money after seeing probability disclosures. Of the 362 loot box purchasers who saw the probability disclosures, 72.4% reported that their loot box purchasing behavior has not been affected by probability disclosures, and that only 19.3% reported buying fewer loot boxes and spending less. Now, what does the survey results tell us? Taken all together, of all the 428 loot box purchasers, only 16.4% reported buying fewer loot boxes and spending less after seeing probability disclosures. This suggests that even if loot box probability disclosures are implemented prominently, their effectiveness at reducing spending is limited. A more interventionist measure may be necessary to effectively reduce spending and minimize harm. Regulators should consider stronger measures, such as imposing maximum spending limits to ensure consumer protection. What further research do we need to conduct? Firstly, all research has been based on self-reported data. This means that the data itself is not perfectly reliable. Players might have remembered their spending wrong or even provided false information. So what we need is industry data held by video game companies on how much players actually spend on loot boxes in order to conduct more scientific and reliable research. I know that many listeners here may have connections with video game companies. I believe there are companies out there who would want to provide the best service to its players and to do business in an ethical manner. Therefore, if you may be able to help us with obtaining industry data, we can answer these research questions together and provide Chinese and indeed international players with the consumer protection that they rightfully deserve. Thank you very much for listening. I would like to thank our friends again at CDiGRA for making this research possible. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask us during the Q&A session. You are, of course, more than welcome to contact us in the future as well. Thank you very much.